Secure retirement.
Because peace of mind is real wealth.
Welcome, everyone. We're glad you could join us today for our presentation called Our Economy in Pictures. While each month I normally write an in-depth written analysis of the economy and markets, this month we decided to try to do it all, or pretty much all, through charts and pictures. The first one is called The Big Picture: Economic Growth in the United States from 1961 through the present. The main thing to look at with this chart is these last 12 years. Because if you took these last 12 years, you can see since 1961, generally growth has been going down. What you can't see on this chart is that if this started in 1776, when our nation started, this last 12 years was the slowest economic growth of any 12 years other than the Great Depression. So economic growth, very low. And of course, you can see last year, it went down due to the pandemic. Now we're going to look at the same thing, actually, economic growth, but defined as the combination of something called the velocity of money. That's the dark line. And that means how much does money change hands in a year? Every time somebody buys something and sells something, money changes hands. That's called economic growth. You add that all up, you get our total economic activity. If it was more than last year, it's growth. If it's less, we're in recession. So how often money changes hands is a key. The other half, though, is how much money there is. That's the red line. The red line is all the money in circulation in our nation. If you know how much money you've got and how often it's trading hands, you can come up with an exact knowledge of how much your economy is growing. If you look at the dark line, how often money's been changing hands, you can see it's been going down since 2010 overall, and then it fell off a cliff when the pandemic started last March and April. The red line has been going up quite a lot, actually, even though it doesn't look like it from 2010. That was still a big increase, and then went through the roof when the pandemic hit. The money in our economy went through the roof because Congress sent checks to everybody in the country. Not Congress, the Treasury Department sent checks to everybody, and businesses also had a huge amount of government money come into their accounts. So that's the red line. The amount of money in the economy went through the roof, but economic growth is the combination of how much money there is and how much it changes hands. You can put all the money out there you want. If it just sits there, no growth. So you can see the problem last year. When the pandemic started, money stopped moving. Everybody went home. Nobody was spending money. Velocity crashed, and that's how you get this sharp downturn last year in the economy. What's going on with velocity of money? As you can see, it crashed. Well, there are two parts to velocity of money. Keep in mind, velocity is how often money changes hands. Well, anytime money changes hands, you got a buyer and a seller, or a lender and a borrower. The biggest spigot for the money to go into the economy is the banking system. They lend the money. On this chart, the dark line shows how much banks are lending based on how much they've got in deposits. As you can see, it's bounced around, and then it fell off a cliff last March and April. Bank lending essentially stopped, and it went down, 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 and it hasn't come back up at all. That is half of the reason why velocity, money hasn't been changing hands, because it's just sitting in the banks. Until or unless the banks start lending that money, it's almost impossible. Well, it is impossible for the economy to really grow. What happens next? Well, the money supply growth That's ending. If you look here, that red line, that was all the government sending those checks to us and sending them to businesses, all the loans and the bailouts. It's over. That line's coming way back down. Well, since economic growth equals how much money you've got and how much it's turning over, if you know you're going to have a lot less money coming, which we are, because the government isn't going to keep doing that, well, then that money better start turning over a lot. What is the biggest driver for it turning over? Well, it's the banks who do one side of the equation. They put the money out there, but it's the consumers who spend most of it. They're the other half. Therefore, what's the consumer doing? What's their status? There's a reason that's such a big topic in economics and markets. Well, what affects the consumer? Number one, jobs. This chart shows the percentage of all the people in the country who are 16 and older, who have a job versus those who don't have a job. If you look at the black line, the dark blue maybe, the dark line here, it shows that right before the pandemic, 62 and a half, just over that, 62.5% of the people 16 and older had a job. If you look at this line, it's kind of hard to see here, but first it goes way down with the pandemic, and then it jumped back up, but notice where it's landed at this point. It's landed here at 58.4, and that's 7 million jobs less. So we're missing 7 million jobs right now. Plus, the last jobs report from last month, we only gained 200 and some thousand jobs. So the gains may be over, which means if they are, we're in a hole. And by the way, the red line shows female employment, which is obviously an important topic as well. But for today, I wanted to focus on the total. And the total is job hiring has slowed down, and we're 7 million short of where we were a year ago, January. Now we get to the big one from some respects when it comes to the consumers, spending, retail sales and food spending. As you can see from the chart, normally it goes up, up, and up. It crashed last spring when the pandemic hit. People don't spend much when they don't ever leave the house, obviously. Then they got their checks, and then they got second checks, and you can see they went on a spree. Unfortunately, for the last 4 months, that has ended. It's ended rather dramatically. And in fact, we've never had a 4-month downturn in spending that was not occurring in a recession. So that needs to turn around like right away, or it's going to be very bad for the US economy. That's 70, consumer spending, keep in mind, is 70% of our economy. That 4 months is worrisome. Then we've got something called the Citigroup Economic Surprise Index. It simply measures if all the economic information that comes out each week is coming out better or worse than anticipated. Unfortunately, it went negative for the first time since last June in May. So beginning in May, the economic news coming out went from being, oh, it was better than we thought it was going to be, to being worse. Unfortunately, for 4 straight months now, it's been worse and worse and worse. Economic performance is falling off a cliff, just like consumer expectations are falling off a cliff. And then we have University of Michigan consumer expectations. This is the gold standard for measuring what consumer plans, worries, what consumers are thinking about doing with their money going forward. Look at it right here. It is now below where it was last March, April, May. In fact, it's at an 8-year low. And look at that. That's 4 months. consumers are getting very, very negative. I'm sure it has something to do with the Delta variant of COVID. Of course, there's a lot of things going on that might make people to be a little concerned. That is the broad economic background today. There are, of course, a lot of other ways we could look at it, and we're constantly searching to try to find the clues showing where things are likely to go in the intermediate, basically just in the intermediate term. As we'll see in a moment, we got a pretty good idea where they're going to end up in the longer term. But in the intermediate term, there's been so much uncertainty. And until just recently, quite frankly, it was hard to have any idea what the next leg of this journey was going to be. But some of the clouds are starting to part. And when you look at what's going on now, there's certainly room for a lot of concern. Speaking of concerns, I'd like to briefly touch now in conclusion on our two biggest risks that we face, the economy and certainly investors. Number one would be called corporate debt. This chart shows the trading, how much of the worst corporate debt, these are loans that companies made and they're never going to pay it back, probably. So the worst loans, well, guess what? They've gone through the roof in size. This shows how much of them are out there being processed. The red line shows how much interest people lending the money are receiving. So the key to the red line is that with all this debt, it should be way high. These companies are essentially bankrupt. They're not going to pay it back. So you should get a big payout for taking that risk. It's simply another case of where risk is being ignored. People think, oh, it doesn't exist because, and then you hear crazy things not connected to any economic or even market reality. The reality is that this debt is real. Corporate debt is so far above the highest point, the biggest amount ever relative to the size of our economy. It's a very scary chart when you analyze it. And now the other big risk is called the stock market. Because when the stock market comes crashing down, it actually is a terrible thing for the entire economy. We're going to look at the stock market from two perspectives. The first is called the Buffett indicator. It's called how big the entire stock market is relative to the size of the entire economy. And as you can see, Warren Buffett's favorite indicator to tell us if we're in a bubble is right here. The previous biggest bubble ever was right here, the internet bubble, the dot-com bubble. What this shows is we're way higher than we were then. This is a good shorthand way to tell if stocks are overpriced. A more precise and accurate way is John Hussman's. He calls it non-financial market cap to non-financial corporate gross value added. I'm not going to go into all the details of exactly what that means. It's essentially the same as this. He just made refinements to make it more accurate. And as you can see, you are here. I'm often asked these days, Richard, you are so certain this is going to end by crashing down. How can you know that? How can we know that it won't just go up forever? Well, the answer to that really is that the only reason it's going up like this is called psychology. There's nothing economic underneath it. I mean, we've looked at economic numbers. They hardly would support something like this. It's pure psychology. When does that psychology end? I don't know. It's very difficult to predict crazy people's psychology because that's what the market is these days. Will it end? I say yes, with 100% certainty. And the reason I am so certain is because it's all based upon human psychology. And I've never seen human psychology get stuck on one side ever. Right now, it's stuck on enthusiasm, greed, and excitement. That will flip to fear and worry and anger and the opposite emotions. So, unless those emotions have been removed from the human psyche, I say this is plunging back down to fair value, which is about 75% lower than it is today. That's a huge risk for, I started to say, our economic recovery, but I don't know what you would call where we're at today in the economy. Troubled would probably be the best word. There still is a lot of uncertainty. But one thing I'm not uncertain about is what's going to happen with the stock market. And whenever that does occur, the rest of the economy, I'm afraid, is likely to follow suit, which is obviously going to be a very difficult time for our nation. That being said, from an investment standpoint, it's not negative at all if you know what you're doing. If you're aware of what's going on, if you're prepared in advance, and that is an absolute key. If you're ready in advance for these types of things, you can act, with a cool head, do what's right, and actually benefit from these crazy gyrations up and then later on down. So from an investment standpoint, all these things are not negative or worrisome if you have your eyes open. Of course, for the world at large, for our country, the concerns are real. Fortunately, here at Secure Retirement, we don't have to solve all of our nation's woes. We simply have to make sure we respond prudently and opportunistically to what the economy and markets are telling us. So with that, I'll end for today. Thank you all very much for viewing this, and please let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.